This is Food for Thought with Deborah Walker. You're listening to Natural Health Radio. I'm Deborah Walker and this is Food for Thought. And today I have Obhi Chatterjee with me, director and producer of a new film about dementia. It's called You Must Be Nuts. Welcome, Obhi.
Thank you very much.
Now, you wrote a brilliant article called Keeping My Dad Alert, an unconventional and successful approach to dementia, which I thought I just had to talk to you about far more than just that article, because I thought that so many people would benefit from hearing about your experience of dementia in your family. Then I found out that you're creating a film on the subject matter, which we've been waiting to be released. And on the day I get to watch it, in the news I see that the GPs in the UK are now being offered £55 for diagnosing dementia. So this has currently become very, very suddenly very current. So before we actually move on to the film and talk about that, what's your feeling about the GP proposal and the potential issues that might arise from it?
Well, I mean, I was reading the article this morning, actually, on the BBC, and I was in two minds about it. On the one hand, the experience that we had with my father was that we could sense that something was wrong about 5 years ago. He must have sensed that something was wrong much earlier. And he was doing all sorts of, he was looking into mind games and all this kind of thing. And I know that he was never interested, when I was small, he was never interested in games like chess and so on. It was not anything that interested him. But suddenly he took an interest in mind games, and I think it was because he could sense that something was changing. Although he did not let on, and he was, every time we would ask him, he would say he was fine and all of that, and he would try to reassure us that he was quite independent and perfectly happy being on his own and so on. In reality, I think we could already tell from about certainly 2009, if not before, that something was really not quite right. But when we took him along to the doctors, it didn't help that when we took him along there, then the doctor asked him, well, why are you here? And he said, well, he would say typically, well, I don't know why I'm here, which didn't exactly help. But it was something which he was resistant to disclose that there was anything wrong. But at the same time, he could sense and we could sense that something was changing, and the doctors attributed it simply to his growing older. Now, if suddenly for £55 that means that the diagnosis would immediately have been dementia, I'm not sure that necessarily changes much, because there's not really an awful lot that the medical profession currently has on offer for people who are diagnosed with dementia.
You know, they're saying that there's about 90,000 patients are living with undiagnosed dementia, and you're saying that even if it was diagnosed, there's very little they could do for those extra people, and in effect that money could be used far better in other arenas potentially.
Well, potentially. The thing is that even with my father, the diagnosis of dementia was, even after he had been referred to a specialist, was not easy, because even after an MRI scan, there was nothing that showed up as being physically wrong with his brain. There was nothing, none of the typical signs that the specialist was expecting to find, given the symptoms that she could see, were apparent from the MRI scan. And so it was still a few months after that she finally concluded that even if there was no evidence that she could actually kind of put her finger on, then all the symptoms matched frontotemporal dementia. And it's a very specific form of dementia. And when she mentioned it, then of course the first thing I did was to look up what it meant. And there were many symptoms that we hadn't mentioned to her, which fitted very precisely exactly the sorts of things that we were seeing with my father.
So you're basically saying there is an umbrella basically of a collection of symptoms. Do you want to just outline some of those that your father was experiencing for us?
Well, one of the things that the first thing that we noticed is that my father was always somebody. I mean, we couldn't keep up with my father. Sorry?
Nothing. Carry on.
Okay, sorry. So we couldn't my wife and I couldn't keep up with my father because he was always full of ideas. He was full of projects. We could hardly find the time to see him between his various different appointments, even after he'd retired, or maybe even particularly after he'd retired. Then he was permanently active. And suddenly, in about 2009, then we realized that he was much less active than before, and actually he was spending more and more time lying down. It's something that we just had not seen him like before. But we could see that, we could understand that he would be a little bit tired, and in the beginning we thought that it would probably be good that he was actually taking a little bit of a breather from his hectic planning. But gradually he seemed to be spending longer and longer lying down, and more of the day seemed to be lying down. And gradually, as we learned from our friends, and he used to give singing lessons at home, and there would be a fairly regular turnover of students who would be coming and visiting during the week. We were finding out from them that they were not actually coming just because they were not able to do that themselves. They were not coming as regularly as they had been, and so our impression that he was fully occupied during the week was not actually the reality. So that was the first symptom, this kind of lack of energy that he seemed to be feeling. And then gradually, although that was not very obvious, he was struggling to find words. Looking back, we can see these symptoms much more easily and with hindsight. But frontotemporal dementia affects the part of the brain which deals with vocabulary, which deals with the sense of initiatives, and with also a lack of inhibition if you're suffering from it. And gradually, all of these things started to become much more apparent, and we started to have problem. I mean, he was a keen gardener, and we noticed that he was spending less and less time in the garden. He was quite hostile, in fact, towards the idea of when we proposed getting a gardener to look after the garden, because the gardener was just beginning to get overgrown, because he didn't seem to find the time to do anything with it. And so gradually, I mean, we could sense that there was a problem, but it was something which, because he was perhaps in denial about it as well. And again, coming back to this idea, if you pay a doctor to diagnose dementia, then maybe you might see an increase in the number of diagnoses, but it might not be something coming voluntarily from the people who are suffering from it, because they may not actually know themselves that that's what it is, or they may not want to admit that that's what it is.
So when you discovered the diagnosis, and you found that actually the medical route was not really going to be a route for you, what did you then start to do to actually help your father? What was the journey that you actually took?
Well, the thing was, it's not only the fact that we discovered that the medical route was not for us. The specialist told us that there was no medical route that was available to us, because the only drug that is actually available for normally just Alzheimer's, and that's a different part of the brain. It's never been tested on frontotemporal dementia, or found to be beneficial for frontotemporal dementia, and so then we were asking, well, is there anything that we could do? And what she said is that, well, you could look at alternative treatments. And at about the same sort of time, one of our neighbours had forwarded us a video which showed the experience of somebody in the US who had been giving coconut oil to her husband, who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and apparently had found it beneficial. Mm. So then I mentioned this to the specialist, and she said, well, do look into whatever you find. And so I started looking more into coconut oil, and we actually did find that giving my father some coconut oil did help. We didn't expect any instant reaction, especially given that we were told that there was no known medical solution for this type of dementia. But we did seem to find that when we started giving it to him, and at that stage he was fully able to take his own decisions and judge for himself what he was doing, and he agreed to follow this course. And I must say that personally I would not necessarily take a mouthful of coconut oil just by itself, but he kind of tried it just to see what it was like, and knowing that this was something which was possibly the only thing that would help, he was prepared to try it out. And that's something which has been guiding us throughout all of this. Now, his vocabulary is now, he doesn't say anything now, which makes it very difficult for people looking after him. But that was something which already went quite a lot earlier. And now we're thinking about whether we shouldn't start giving him some kind of speech therapy to try to encourage him to speak again.
So let's move on to the film, which is called You Must Be Nuts, of which I love the title, I have to say. Tell the audience how the film has come about. Was it inspired from your father? Is it about the journey? Just explain to the audience about it.
Yes, it's sort of certainly it's inspired by the journey, but there are things which I would have liked to have known back then, at the time that we had the diagnosis, which took me probably a year and a half to find after a lot of research, with lots of kind of red herrings thrown around all over the place by different websites, just pouring kind of scorn on anything which was not supposedly evidence-based. And I have to say that, my background originally is I'm a statistician, so I do know something about evidence and how you analyze evidence. And what I was finding was that there was not really an awful lot of evidence underpinning all of the people who were criticizing the lack of evidence.
If that makes sense.
If that makes sense. So, I think you see this most clearly. One of the first things I came across when looking into coconut oil, was that people were saying, oh, you shouldn't do that because it could lead to heart disease. Yes. And then I started looking up links between coconut oil and heart disease, and sure enough, it was saying that coconut could lead to heart disease. In fact, even the NHS website says that coconut oil could lead to heart disease and you shouldn't have it. But then if you actually look at the statistics, then, a country like Sri Lanka, where the whole population has been having lifestyles centered on coconuts and coconut oil, up until the 1978 UNDP report, which actually I think took data from 1968, they didn't have any heart disease. And it's one of the countries in the world which had the least heart disease at the time. And then a later report, I think from 2000, then you started to find that people were having heart disease in Sri Lanka, and the only thing, and actually dementia as well. And I think the only thing that had changed was that the average number of coconuts per year per person that they were consuming had dropped from 132 to 90. That was the only change really in their diet, was that they were having less coconuts. And that was causing the increase in heart disease. So it's completely counterintuitive. The actual evidence that is around, if you look for it.
Well, Patrick Holford in the film points out that we've become phobic around fats, particularly saturated fats, yet they're vital for health, aren't they?
That's the thing. We seem to have been, and that's also the problem with right at the beginning of the film. You'll have seen the excerpt from Fathead, where Tom Norton was looking into where this whole idea came from, that fats were terrible. And it all seems to have come from one particularly influential scientist, Ansel Keys, who came up with, first of all, theory, and then what's been regarded as a kind of landmark study, which seemed to prove that the more fat you consumed, the more heart disease you would have. But of course, that was an epidemiological study, and it's something which looks at an overall population, and this is something which cannot possibly give you evidence of a causal relationship between one thing and another. Not to mention the fact that Ansel Keys did what any statistician would have probably killed him for, which is to pick only the data which happened to fit his hypothesis. And this is not science. Science is where you have a hypothesis and you then set about proving that hypothesis, and anything which disproves that hypothesis is basically a sign that your hypothesis is wrong, not that you picked the wrong data. So it's something where he was so clearly so determined to prove his hypothesis that he ignored anything which didn't fit the hypothesis. And simply because he had a lot of influence up until that point and had contacts from all over the world, then he was able to influence the whole course of how the world's scientific bodies have been viewing fats. It seems like a conceptually obvious connection to make between if you eat fat, then you're going to become fat. But it doesn't read, the studies actually, even at that time, didn't show that. There were plenty of studies at the time. I think Pete Ahrens was one of the people who Nina Teicholz in Big Fat Surprise in her book has mentioned, was saying that actually cholesterol is not a very good predictor of heart disease. It's more triglyceride levels, for example. But today you won't find any doctor who's trying to get their patients to be doing tests for triglyceride levels to find out whether they're susceptible to heart disease.
Now, it's a very simplistic viewpoint, isn't it, really, that fat, if you eat fat, it becomes fat in the body. It's really ignoring the synergistic, the synergy that actually happens when you eat nutrition.
Yeah. No, exactly. There's two links which you kind of presume physiologically as to why that should happen, but fundamentally, as Patrick also points out in the film, cholesterol is pretty fundamental to all animal life. If you look up cholesterol in Wikipedia, That's what differentiates animals from plants. And if you then start depriving us, the human body, or even anybody, even pets, of fat, thinking that this is going to reduce their heart disease, there are certain things which you should be aware of, which are going to be impacted, and one of those is the brain, which is where 25% of the body's cholesterol is to be found.
Well, Ansel Keys' own work showed that actually if you reduce your cholesterol levels down, which is what they're constantly trying to do, that not only did it have an impact across the body, but actually your morbidity rates were likely to go up. And in fact, they did go up if you're over, I think it was either 55 or 60. So even his research at the time showed that.
Yes, and I think also towards the end of his life, I think by the time he was 80 or 90 or something, in an interview then with the Wall Street Journal, he had actually admitted, and not very many people seem to have been aware of this, he seems to have admitted that the whole focus on cholesterol was perhaps overblown.
Incredible, really, isn't it, that actually one hypothesis has had what is highly likely to be this whole domino effect on health, and has potentially created significant chronic health. You know, you're talking about, well, we're talking about brain health at the moment, but you've got heart disease, you've potentially got diabetes because of the fact that we've increased carbohydrates, so we've lowered fats and brought up carbohydrates. There's a huge knock-on effect, isn't there, here? Yes, obesity as well, and so all of these things which have just increased by pure coincidence, according to the official evidence-based enthusiasts, since in the last 30 years. This is something which I would venture to suggest is not entirely coincidental. And this is actually what I mentioned it in the film. There's a book with the unlikely title "Dying for a Hamburger," which was written by a coroner from Toronto, who started looking into why it was that he was facing so many more cases of people dying from Alzheimer's than he had been used to. And what he found was that by looking through all of not only the scientific literature, but also the dramatic literature, the arts, the religious literature, everything, then up until even fairly recently, the 1960s, it's not as if people assumed that if they were growing older, they were going to be going effectively nuts. The prevailing assumption at the time was that you needed to respect your elders, that the older you were, the wiser you were, and even if you go back to Shakespeare and King Lear and all of these things, it was quite exceptional that King Lear was thought of as being mad, and not as something like, oh yes, he's reached that age when he's going to be like that. I think you've got a very good point there. If you look at tribal traditions, the elders were held in very high esteem. Their wisdom was incredibly valuable, and it was passed down. And now, as you say, it's almost considered that you get to a certain point and you start to lose your faculties. And that shouldn't truly be the case. Coming back to fats, I remember as a child, now I'm a child of the 60s, that my mother used to give us dripping butties. She used to give us, bread dipped in the meat fats, and we would have that. We would have all of the stock all made out of the meat itself. That's no longer done, and for years, at least 2 generations since the low fat craze has happened, and the hype, as one of your interviewers calls it, in effect has stripped out a massive portion of the diet.
Yes, and I think that's one of the real problems. that we also have in the film Justin Smith, who although we don't mention it in the film, but he's a nutritionist originally, and he was advising personalities at the BBC about their diet. And when I was asking him, and you can find this in one of the earlier, the full interviews that we did with him, he explains how he got into this whole idea. Was that he was finding that the advice that he was giving to his clients on a one-to-one basis just wasn't working. And he was following whatever he had been taught about nutrition, which was that people should be having a low-fat diet. He was just finding it wasn't working. And actually, it's in the last decade or so that people have finally found enough resources to do full clinical trials on diet. It's very difficult to control people's diets, and this is one of the problems about this type of large-scale studies. And when people say, "Oh, where is the evidence?" Well, Ansel Keys never had any evidence either. In fact, he definitely didn't have any evidence. In fact, he buried most of the evidence. And even more recent studies, which were also epidemiological studies, whenever they came across evidence which was inconvenient, which didn't fit the low-fat hypothesis, they buried it. And this is something which emerges from the work that Nina Teichholz has done in Big Fat Surprise. I mean, she's an investigative journalist, and she's been through all of the studies since the early 1900s in this field, and noted that scientists, because they would face kind of the sort of fate that they would never get any more research funding, or they would never be invited to another conference again as a speaker. They were inclined to bow down to the prevailing view. But the evidence is still there if you read the actual details of the studies they did.
Well, there's a lot of medical careers been built on that particular theory, and just some medications, the pharmaceutical medications like statins have been built on that theory, and that's a huge financial area. So it's going to be very difficult to actually get people to speak out if they've built their whole career on it through their lifetime.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things. There is a debate on in the UK at the moment, which was in yesterday's news, about health professionals calling on the Parliamentary Health Select Committee to look into how exactly the latest statin guidelines were set up by NICE. And the thing is that NICE seems to have a rather odd policy, which, according to their response to the criticism earlier in this year along these lines, was that, well, everybody has declared their conflict of interest. Well, normally, my understanding of a conflict of interest means that it rules you out from being on such a panel. And it's something which is, it's not enough simply to say you have a conflict of interest and you can be aware of that, and the fact that I've declared it is enough for you to be aware that whatever I'm recommending in this panel could be taken with a pinch of salt. These are national guidelines, and it's not only problematic that, from my perspective, that they were developed by a panel which Zoe Harcombe has put together, assembled the background information about what sort of connections they had with the pharmaceutical industry, specifically the manufacturers of precisely the drugs which would be prescribed in greater quantities as a result of the guidance. But also that the evidence, the data on which the guidance was supposed to be based cannot apparently be published. And this seems to be completely out of line with the UK government's open data policy. Because if you were able to publish the data, then anybody who had any statistical background would be able to take that data and would be able to analyze it and presumably come to the same conclusions as NICE and say, oh yes, these guidelines make perfect sense because the data support it. But the fact that the data are not available doesn't exactly inspire confidence.
The issue here is there's two sides to it, isn't there? Because you've got a business that wouldn't want to give its confidential data out, and you can understand that in some respects because it will enable others to actually create the same product. So you've got that confidential aspect of it, but then you've got the aspect of it where there's no ability to trust these people or these companies because they're creating products that you are that matter to your health and can truly impact on your long-term health. And, you know, they're being shown, these companies, that they really can't be trusted in many cases. They're putting out medications that are, in some respects, some of them are dangerous. Some of them have got side effects, and they know there's issues behind them, and they're not being transparent about it. So there's a whole trust issue there, isn't there?
There is, and you're probably familiar with Dr. Ben Goldacre and the All Trials campaign. And I have to say this issue about confidentiality of data, particularly in the case of statins, to me it's a little bit doubtful. Statins fell out of the patents protection periods already. And so the confidentiality of the data seems to be a little bit, also a little bit of a kind of a veil of secrecy, which may or may not be justified, but it's certainly something that I would be very doubtful that you could claim that something which has been, statins are now out of patent, and anybody could be making them. And so the fact that their data from their studies, which, we don't know the extent to which they were publicly funded anyway, it seems very, very doubtful that there's really an argument for confidentiality for these types of data. I don't think any drug manufacturer has been able to prove in court that that there is a problem with disclosing these types of data from studies in terms of business secrets.
I think it's very really important point that you make in regards to the public funding, because actually they get significant public funding for their research, and and that in itself should mean that there's a freedom of information around it.
There's there's public sector information legislation, which is all about precisely that point. And so I think there's a strong case to say that that would cover precisely this type of data.
Now let's get back to your film. It's pointed out in the film that there's several things that are causing a rise in dementia potentially, and one of them's medications themselves. It was pointed out about the diet fizzy drinks, as we call them in the UK, or the sodas, organophosphates. Can you just expand on these for me so that people understand why they're actually an issue? What your research was into these?
Bear in mind that I started off from coconut oil, and I suppose looking back, it was a fairly naive start into this whole arena. I must say that I mean, before anybody goes away with the impression that I'm a sort of I've always been fiendishly difficult about what I eat and so on, I must say I didn't really think about this until I started looking into what might have caused my father's dementia, and it's something which I must say that I'm much more aware of today than I was 2 years ago when we first started thinking about all of this. And even before my father-in-law, unfortunately, he had Alzheimer's disease and sadly passed away last February. So it's something that we have been very conscious of for some time. But in my father-in-law's case, we followed whatever the medical experts were recommending, and I must say that it was not an awful lot. It was a case of simply waiting patiently for the end to come. It's not a very hopeful perspective. But looking into coconut oil then led me into the whole issue of why are people so phobic about fats, and saturated fats in particular, and what is it about coconut oil that is helpful for the brain. And then I started looking into the connection between diet and Alzheimer's, and that very quickly led me to basically the people who we've interviewed in the film. So Jerome Byrne, who wrote the article in the Daily Mail about somebody who's now actually a friend of ours, thanks to that, Carl Palmer, to whom he started, whose father he started giving coconut oil to, and finding benefits, thanks to also pretty much the same video that we had been watching. And then also Justin Smith was talking about this in his film Statin Nation, and particularly Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who is a senior research scientist at MIT, has been looking into this. And what we found then was that she had written a paper which was vaguely entitled about nutrition and Alzheimer's. And what I was intrigued to discover was that this was not actually the original title of her paper, which was much more focused and more along the lines of how the low-fat diet and statins could be causing Alzheimer's. And one of the things that we asked her about specifically was her experience of getting that paper published, and apparently she was unable to get that paper published until all the references to statins were deleted.
Huh.
And that then leads to the question: well, what's then going on with our medical journals? So Justin Smith then pointed me in the direction of a book which has been written by Dr. Richard Smith, who's no relation, but Dr. Richard Smith has a certain amount of experience in this field. He used to be the editor of the British Medical Journal for a number of years, and he's written a book called The Trouble with Medical Journals. And one of the things that he points out, I mean, there are several problems that he highlights, and it's fascinating reading. It's quite depressing reading as well, if you want to, but fascinating reading about the sorts of things which face a potential conflict of interest for the editors of medical journals, because their main source of revenue is not only advertising from the pharmaceutical companies, but also reprints of articles which are requested by the pharmaceutical companies, all about the drugs which they, perhaps positive articles about the drugs which they're promoting, which they would like to circulate. So there is an uncomfortable relationship, and perhaps we sensed this a little bit earlier this year when there was criticism of two articles in the British Medical Journal itself, which criticised the role of statins and the enthusiasm for statins, and questioning whether they should be as widely prescribed as they have been. One was written by a cardiologist, and another was written by a researcher in the US. And both of them were being criticized by one of the main, as I understand it, one of the main enthusiasts for statins in the UK. And there was an investigation which was launched by the British Medical Journal into whether or not these two articles ought to be retracted. To the credit of the British Medical Journal, they not only concluded that the articles didn't need to be retracted, even if there was a correction which needed to be made because one statistic was published as being around 20% instead of being 18% or something like that in one of the articles. And rather than completely retracting the entire articles. But alongside that, they also published the exchange of correspondence which led to the investigation, which I think Zoe Harcombe was again who started looking into that and adding up how much money from pharmaceutical companies had been invested into the research done by the person who had called for these retractions.
It's a complete minefield now with health, isn't it, really? In some respects. Now, many people, you point this out in the film, and the two puppets are brilliant, I have to say, because all the way through the film they're changing their diet, and they're introducing different types of foods, those foods that would have been cut out in the last 2 generations, last 40 years, things like eggs, things like butter, saturated fats, and things like this. And people think they're making healthy choices, but often, they're not, and it's because the way all these other foods have been marketed. What's the key piece of advice that made the biggest difference to yourselves and your father?
Well, I think, I don't know whether it was necessarily a key piece of advice, but if the entire principle, which has been guiding everything I've been eating for the last 40 years or so, which is actually based on kind of fictitious, or rather, not necessarily fictitious data, but on rather questionable conclusions drawn from a particular data set, then it starts to make you wonder what else might be problematic about everything that we've been hearing, and then, I mean, my family origins are in India. My wife is Indian. And there's a strong tradition of Ayurvedic medicine there, which has been going on for many generations longer than the 40-year enthusiasm for the low-fat diet. And I think that what you're seeing in the puppets is actually pretty much a slightly condensed version of the the dialogue which my wife and I were having over time as we were making the film, and based on the interviews the reactions we had from the interviewees and the comments they were making, because we were then sort of left wondering, well, what are we supposed to believe then? And what are we supposed to rely on? And I think it's coincided with a number of different things which have reinforced in our minds the sorts of things that we have been picking up along the way. One of the first things which I came across was the books by Dr. Bruce Clive in the US, who was talking about coconut oil and coconut oil miracle and all of the different things that coconut oil can do. And it was his book which kind of led to health food shops stocking coconut oil in the early 2000s, because he demonstrated that actually it was a rather sort of fictitious marketing campaign which led to them being denounced as, artery clogging saturated fats. Well, there's nothing artery clogging about saturated fats, as we now know. Yeah. And so this then started to lead us on to other areas of things, and I had resisted the temptation to read a book called Stop Alzheimer's Now for several months, actually, because I thought the title was too unlikely. But eventually I decided to bite the bullet and get it, and it actually confirmed a lot of the things which I had been finding out from the people we had been interviewing and from the research I had been doing online. And it set out the sort of, I wouldn't say medications, but the sort of nutritional supplements which we needed to be taking, or making sure that we include in our diets. And then towards the end of last year, we've seen the publication of Grain Brain by Dr. David Perlmutter, which again reinforced pretty much the same sorts of ideas, and then highlighted the importance of gluten sensitivity in this whole issue. And then even more recently, we've seen the book Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz, which underlines the lack of scientific evidence underlying everything that we've been hearing about the low-fat diet. So, as you've seen, one of the questions that we asked in the film is that, well, why are people still enthusiastic about the low-fat diet, even though there doesn't seem to be any scientific evidence behind it? And it seems to be related to, it's not purely the food industry. I think the food industry gets a bad name because it's providing, to some extent, it's reacting to market pressure. And the supermarkets are stocking what people are buying, or interested in buying. But why are people interested in buying them? Well, national guidance has a role, and then this comes back to the question of why are people being told that they need to keep their cholesterol levels down, and why are people being prescribed statin medications to keep their cholesterol levels down, and why are people being told that they need to avoid saturated fats in the NHS guidance, and all of these questions, actually, which I raised via our MP, never seem to get answered. And so I think it's about time that there's actually a formal investigation into the way the dietary guidance and the medical guidance have been set in the UK, at least in the UK, for the last 30 or 40 years. Because I think it's responsible for not only a serious impact on the nation's health, and I would lay the blame for my father's dementia fairly squarely on that type of guidance, but also it's something that's entirely avoidable, and it's costing the NHS billions. Even today or yesterday, the NHS has published a report saying that they need much, much more money. Well, the NHS needs much, much more money to some extent because it's created a lot of problems for itself by the misleading dietary guidance that it's putting out. That's what I seem to conclude from what I've found. But I would recommend that if the government doesn't believe that and doesn't believe what I've found, they should go out and do a full formal investigation. And I think that should be done at a parliamentary level, it should be done at a government level. And then I hope, really hope, that we see some national dietary guidance which is based on evidence. And the only country I'm aware of which that has happened is Sweden. Last September, Sweden published the results of a scientific survey of all the evidence that exists on dietary studies. And they concluded that something which is, in effect, low carbohydrate, high fat diet was the one which was going to be best for their nation. And if that's what they conclude, then it's very difficult to understand why other nations which have not carried out any such recent review of the evidence still are still saying what they were saying 30 years ago.
I think you make some really strong points there in regards to the changing of public policy and how it's influenced. Obhi, how do people find out about your film? Where do they go to see it? When is it released?
Well, the part of the reason I'm able to talk to you, and part of the reason I've been able to give you access to a kind of pre-final version of the film, is that we're very close to finishing the film, and I hope within the next week or two, after I've tidied up a few things, then we'll be able to launch it. I think it's going to be a very discreet launch because it'll probably be just something on YouTube, but I hope that you and others, particularly those who have been mentioned in the film and those who've been interviewed in the film, will help to at least make people aware of it through social media. You can follow the film on Twitter. There's @YouMustBeNuts. Which is the Twitter handle, and there what we're trying to do is to put out a lot of the more recent research, because in the film there's a limit to how much we can actually put out. And there's also a website which is associated with the film, which is youmustbenuts.info. And because the interviews went on for much longer than we could possibly include in the film, we'll also be publishing the full interviews, so people can have access. Some of them are already available, but all of them will be there soon. So I'm hoping that by the end of the month, then people will be able to watch it on YouTube, and I hope they find it of interest.
Obhi Chatterjee, thank you very much for coming on Food for Thought and Natural Health Radio. You Must Be Nuts will be released, sounds like, in November 2014. Thank you.
Thank you very much.